I am Marcy Burstener. I'm the chair of the Humboldt Center for Constitutional Rights, and we're a local nonprofit. We're a 501c3, and our whole mission is to educate people about their constitutional rights and to try and convince people to actually exercise them. Some people are completely ignorant of their constitutional rights, and some people are very well aware that they have them and are actually reluctant to exercise them. And I'm a big believer that if you don't exercise, your muscles atrophy. And we have to start exercising our constitutional rights. So we had this idea at HumRights. We were a bit troubled by the idea that people were starting to say that they weren't actually going home for Thanksgiving last year. And before that, actually, they were avoiding family gatherings because they didn't want to get into political discussions with their relatives. And to us, that's really troubling because you can fight for First Amendment rights and free speech, and if people are afraid to talk to each other, it really doesn't do any good. So the whole idea of the HumRights bar debate is to take people who are in polar opposite positions and put them in a bar and have them arguing it out, and to demonstrate that we actually can have civil dialogue. And so we're calling this a HumRights bar debate, civil dialogue to combat hate. And we have two people here on the stage with us, Freddie Brewster and Fabian Cuevas, and they are extremely brave. The hardest thing we've had in organizing the bar debate is finding people willing to actually speak. So they get a lot of credit for doing this. What we're talking about is freedom of speech, First Amendment, versus the idea of should people be protected from offensive ideas. So the first question is, do college students need protection from controversial ideas?
So do college students need protection from controversial ideas? Okay. So I guess the first thing I'm going to say is I just want to define like what a safe space is first to understand like what does that protection mean, right? So like just to like make things very simple, I'm not going to go into like a big theorist definition of what a safe space is just to make it in the most simplest form. So I'm going to use your standard textbook dictionary definition of what a safe space is, and that is a place or environment to which a person can feel confident that they will not be exposed to discrimination, criticism, harassment, and emotional or physical harm. This debate, I'm not even going to call it a debate, I'm going to call it more of a conversation, right?
Yeah.
So like this conversation that I'm going to have with Fred is going to be more on, because I don't think Fred's advocating that we're going to, let's allow everyone to be discriminated, right? No. So I think we're going to be talking about like the concept of criticism, critique, which I feel like harmful rhetoric falls under. I'm advocating for safe spaces. I would say that it's not a protection from harmful rhetoric because having harmful rhetoric isn't offensive. It is damaging and traumatic to people who are falling victim to it. So I wouldn't say it's protection from offensive language, it's a protection from harmful actions that are not only cyclical but generational, that affects not only the student themselves but it affects their mental psyche that goes on to, that they'll pass it down to their descendants and to their family members when they go back home and say that this harmful rhetoric that was put on them was not offensive, but it was damaging to their person and their identity.
What do you think?
Well, I think first off, we have to take in consideration what does it mean to be safe from an environment of criticism. Criticism for many people means many different things. And so to say that we should have an environment that is totally free of any sort of critique of an individual or groups is not, it's out of reality. It's not going to happen. And so also at a university level, students should have more of a, not necessarily, I guess there's a safe space, like, safe from physical harm and safe from straight up verbal harassment. But they should, in the classroom settings, they should have an environment that is, quote, safe enough. And in these situations, they should be able to have dialogue that they may feel is critical of them and critical of their viewpoints, but they should be able to express themselves in a way that offers some sort of dialogue to the betterment of the conversation as a whole. And I think just people also in our current times are too quick and too easy to take offense to certain topics without even necessarily having the option to fully comprehend of like anything of what the debate or conversation could be.
Okay. You want to say something, or you
Yeah, I'd
want
like to
move
respond. Like I said, it's not offensive. Like the words aren't offensive where we go and just feel sad for a moment. It's not that. It's a generational thing. It is something that not only impacts you in the moment, but it impacts you after you leave that room. It impacts you when you communicate with your significant others, with your biological or familiar family. It's something that impacts you. It's not something that's like calling someone a mean name. It is something that when you say these offensive things, it comes from generations and history of oppression that comes from it. And I don't think that safe spaces, at least in this case, is like just a simple classroom. That's not what that is. Because at least on my side, I'm not saying that we're going to remove the freedom of speech of like your Kellyanne Conways of the world. They can still go to your YMCA and say all that they want, but at least in this, what we see as safe spaces in an academic institution, they should not be allowed to be in that presence because of what those spaces do for people of those identities.
I guess if we're not having those challenging opinions and discussions in an institution, in a university, then where else will those conversations take place? Because in the environment outside of a university, people just retreat to their own corners. And so I just am trying to wrap my head around when is and is not an appropriate time to have these sorts of conversations that are uncomfortable. And I'm not saying that people should be subjected to, verbal abuse or harassment. Like that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, when is an appropriate time, if not at a university, if not at a place that has, the whole idea of being at a university is challenging your thoughts and learning from it. When is a good time to have these conversations, if not at a university?
I would say, let us again not misconstrue what a safe space is. It's not the university as itself. It is the designated institution within the academic institution that is considered a safe space. So your MCC house, your Latin American Center for Excellence, your African American Center for Excellence, those are the safe spaces which I am advocating for. You have every right to stand in a place on the... Ooh.
Whoops.
I thought I drank too much beer. But, but it's about understanding where the time and place is. And if you're asking me that, I would say the time and place is not where it's a designated place where people of my identity, people of those communities, go to escape from the harmful rhetoric that comes from those classroom settings.
Of course. And, safe spaces are areas that are definitely needed, especially for people of color and people from all types of marginalized groups. I'm obviously a white man and can't, I can only try to imagine to relate to anything of that. But I'm not advocating or saying that people should go into some of these designated areas where they are set aside for people from marginalized groups. I guess what I'm trying to advocate for is, the university as a whole, as a university as an institution. Well, I guess here's an example that I personally experienced. I was in class one day, and the professor called, I think it wasn't the Gilroy shooting, but he called a mass shooter crazy. And a student took offense to that and said that, we shouldn't be calling these types of people, with, certain mental illnesses crazy. And the professor asked him, well, what would be a good word? Essentially just challenged him, what would be a good word to describe this person? And he became so upset that he ended up just storming out of the classroom. And this professor wasn't tenured, and he was honestly worried about his job. And so should professors be concerned about, asking a student not only to clarify their point of view, but also, kind of quote unquote checking them and asking them to really like put thought behind their argument that they're trying to formulate in their head.
That was a question towards you.
Oh, it was just kind of like a statement. Yeah.
If you'd like. If you,
Well, that brings me up to a question I had. You know,
Talking to your
when
mic,
when I first started teaching at HSU, I was teaching a class on mass media, and I decided for the last week of class, because that's when everyone starts falling asleep and thinking about the next term, we were talking about pornography, because pornography is lots and lots and lots of people watch pornography, and that was actually before it became really big on the internet. And my mentor advised me that I should allow students to have a pass on the class if they felt uncomfortable. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I'm teaching about mass media, and pornography is really big in mass media. Shouldn't everyone learn it? So my question is, should students be allowed to have a pass on classes where difficult subjects will be taught? Who wants to start?
you, Freddie.
Okay. Give me a second here. That's a good one. In the spirit of debate, I'm gonna say no. That, kind of like going back to what I said before. If we're at these institutions of higher learning, we should. Excuse me. We should expect some of our experiences to be challenged, to be uncomfortable, but to also, understand that the subject matter is all for our intellectual benefit, and that because some of this subject matter may be triggering, that should not, be a reason to not engage with the text of what we're learning. I don't think that students should be able to cop out of these certain situations. I understand some people may be actually offended, but other people may use it as a reason to get out of a class, which is not necessarily fair to the people who are legitimately, offended by some of the text that will be taught within the class. But going back to my main point is that no, we're in an institution of higher learning, and that we are kind of subjecting ourselves to a learning process. And part of that learning process is subjecting ourselves to situations that we are not always comfortable in or with.
Similar to Freddie, I'm going to be in the spirit of the conversation and say yes. And I'd like to offer some points on that. So, first, it's not, like you said, a cop-out. It's not. It is a last line of defense that people of marginalized communities have to stand up against a system that teaches us a very Eurocentric concentration of education. It is where, when we see in history classes at even a university level, where people from marginalized communities, their identities, their history is not taught in the proper manner, and whereas, for example, how Native Americans are treated as if they were a dying race that were meant to die out because they're the disappearance of Native Americans. But in reality, that's not what happened. They were genocide, they were attacked, their lands were removed from them, and we still see that to this day. As a cop-out, that's not what this is. Also, I truly do believe that with students who do that, we need to give these students a little bit more credit, actually, right? Like, no student's going to actually go and be like, oh, I'm going to use my identity and cop out and just like drop out of this course so I could get an easy A. Most students who come here, who come from those marginalized communities, are trying to do something better for themselves, and not only for themselves, but for their community to move forward in life. So if there ever a student uses this tactic or this opportunity to withdraw from a class because of not something that makes them offended, but something that emotionally damages who they are and their identities, it is something that is going to benefit them and something that they're actually going to think about. They're not going to just cop out just for an easy A. It is something that is a natural response to a generation of oppression that is caused by universities that do advocate for those harmful rhetorical educations.
Well, I guess how would one teach those types of histories that may be harmful and hurtful to teach? In order to learn about Native American history and genocide of not only them, but like many, many, many other marginalized groups, how are we not supposed to have these conversations in a classroom setting that makes people uncomfortable?
Take a class that provides literature and education from people of the communities, I would say.
Are we not having that? I mean, is that not also part of the learning process?
Like being like interdisciplinary. Like there's a difference between being interdisciplinary when you provide a equitable and efficient contribution of both a Eurocentric form of education to providing the input and perspective of people from those communities. There's a difference from that to like being an institution that predominantly provides those harmful.
But I guess I was on the presumption that any sort of credible higher institution was going to teach not necessarily a Eurocentric history, but also one with primary source documents.
Yeah,
well.
that's a reality we all wish truly happens,
Yes.
that all universities that are accredited provide, but not
HSU
even
professors,
close.
are you listening?
Well, back to the point, don't you have to give a pass then to someone who, say, comes from a white supremacist background who finds offensive any class about white privilege? And then don't we end up having, with this idea of allowing people to opt out of concepts, a segregation of ideas?
Is that just directly to me, or?
Yeah, let's start with you.
Okay, yeah. So, the first thing I'm going to say is there is a difference between a white supremacist being offended to a person of color who is learning an education that is not only, one, misrepresenting their history, but also misconstruing and manipulating their culture and their identities. So, no, I don't believe that people who come from a white supremacy background or whatever that means to get that pass, because they don't have the same emotions and same negative impact that people from marginalized communities have. Because in the very end, when they remove themselves from that classroom setting, when they remove themselves from those settings that we have those conversations, they are still systematically in the position of power, something that people from those marginalized communities that leave don't have even after that conversation. So no, I don't believe that white supremacists have the same, I'm not going to continuously call it a cop-out or withdraw, but just they don't have those same benefits from that because they don't come from the same negative impact of power that people of color have to suffer every day when going through.
So I guess for that, I would say there's always a changing narrative of who is and who is not in power. For example, there was a professor at the University of Illinois who got fired for tweets that were advocating for Palestinian rights in Gaza. And you could, in America, we could look at Israelis or Jewish people of Jewish descent as minorities. They may be white, but they are also a religious minority here in America. And so to say that we should not, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's a slippery slope. If we start granting access to one group of people to say that this type of this type of text that we're learning in a certain classroom is offensive to one group, and that we should not teach it because it's offensive to them, then where is the line drawn when that type of learning material is not discussed for all types of people? You can say by and large white supremacists are a minority in America. Take for example, the Charlottesville protest. There was a big pushback against that, and those guys tried to rally again. The following year in Boston, 50 of them showed up, and 30,000 counter-protesters showed up. So I just think it's like to say that certain people are able to get out of a learning, get out of a classroom setting where the text may be kind of rough to hear or controversial or traumatizing to listen to is a slippery slope that will not apply evenly to everyone. That was kind of rambling.
We do have a question from the audience, and that's kind of a follow-up. Should a female student who is recovering from childhood molestation be given a pass from a class covering pornography?
No, because pornography does not necessarily have any sort of ties to child molestation. You know, to say that all porn stars have suffered from past traumatic events is not necessarily an accurate statement. I understand that I guess I can't really understand that from what I've read. People go into that industry due to drug use and due to past traumatic experiences, but I would say that no, just because somebody who has dealt with traumatizing experiences in the past, they should not necessarily be able to get out of learning material.
First off, I'm just going to continuously say this term because it's very important and it's power. I do believe yes, because in the porn industry, it is far more than just your simple like press it, be on it for 15 minutes and then log off. No, it is so much more than that. The way that pornography has been structured in the status and like the way that we see society is extremely traumatic, especially when I'm not sure. I don't want to insinuate or guess the experience that woman has experienced, but it is when you have that happen to you, you're in a position of powerless. Someone above you is putting power on top, putting a power on you. That's not funny, but when with the education of the pornography, when you put that, you're reminding that person that they are not in a position of power, that they're having this system of power upon them. Similar kind of like what you said earlier about how like white supremacists are a minority. I don't believe that's true, for one, because even if like in the numbers of population that might seem accurate, but within the system it's not, because no matter how many people like you can count on numbers, the way that the system works, they're always going to be the ones who are the superiority. Because sometimes marginalized or underrepresented doesn't just mean the numbers of bodies, it means the way that we treat those identities in communities. It is the way that we see and talk about their cultures and history in the classroom, especially in those safe spaces. So yes, I do believe that woman has the right to be removed from that classroom setting if it's talking about pornography, if they've experienced child molestation, because it reminds them and reciprocates the harmful psychological damage of being placed and removed from a position of power while someone else is benefiting by putting power on you.
But that's just like saying that all pornography and all porn stars are victims of some sort of childhood abuse, or that all pornography is saying that it has some sort of realm in child molestation.
I don't think that's what I'm saying at all, and I don't think that that's what's being implied.
Well, I guess I'm not quite sure where the line is.
Yeah, I'll tell you the line, Freddie. So like, it's when what it does, like what rhetorically pornography, the way that it's structured, it does to a community and to an identity. So when you have, we're all adults in here. Like how pornography is, let's.
Not my daughter.
Oh. Yeah. Then pornography is probably not the best thing to be talking about with an underage person.
We're a free speech household.
Yeah. I'm a safe space house. So the way that pornography is structured and filmed and produced, however you want to call it, is there's usually an individual who's dominating another individual for pleasure and for self-interest, which relates back to power. So even if the video itself is not child molestation, the same effects of seeing another person on a video having their position being placed in a powerless position as someone who is deemed as an oppressor is placing power on that person still simulates the same negative impact it does on your psychological well-being as when they were in that present situation. Kind of like how when you, like myself, experience a hate crime, which is why I have a scar on my head, is the same way when I see a film that has a person of color being abused or beaten by a hate group. Although I've never experienced being beaten by a hate group, I do know what it means to be in a powerless position while having people in position of power placing their privilege on top of me.
I have another question from the audience, and this is a question that's directed first to Fabian. All totalitarian regimes restructure speech, or Restrict speech. Why would you do this voluntarily?
For one, I think it's kind of problematic to label this as totalitarianism, for one, because safe spaces are not totalitarianism. Safe spaces are actually beneficial. I know this might seem a little like not realistic. They're very beneficial towards the field of academia because it levels two different voices. One that is the dominant Eurocentric voice that we hear in everyday classrooms, to one that is being elevated by this safe space and given that platform that this one does not provide. So it's not totalitarianism, and we're not to voluntarily do it is not to voluntarily go to totalitarianism. It's to finally give yourself the platform and the voice to elevate your message. So yeah, in the way I think that's a problematic way to define what I am advocating for, because it's not totalitarianism.
I guess, isn't there a shifting narrative of who is and who is not in power? To say that a university or an institution in general should have control over what is and what is not appropriate means that we should give the current Trump administration control over what is and what is not appropriate to be said in these institutions of higher learning.
I don't think like linking an administration of a school to the Trump administration is remotely accurate, for one.
Okay, we could link it to Gavin Newsom, who is our governor of California. I mean, who's to say that somebody that's, akin to somebody like Ronald Reagan can't be elected in another couple years?
So, for one, I don't think that the position of power is a slippery slope. It's always been the same, which is the cis white males are always in the position of power, no matter what. If you want to know more examples about how they are, I'll gladly lay that out to you, such as the feminist movement. We saw the cis white males were always being going against it. We see it in the civil rights era. We see it till this day. And this isn't to limit free speech. Like I'm saying, people can still go to your local YMCAs down the street to still say what you want to say. Freedom of speech being restricted is not plausible. The Supreme Court said that any form of verbal and physical abuse is illegal. So safe spaces are a mandatory thing for communities because we're trying to avoid people from being exposed to this form of abuse that the Supreme Court has deemed is not humane. And I guess like most of these questions are more of like we all agree that freedom of speech is great and I'll defend safe spaces. I like to kind of like, Freddie, like how is freedom of speech really being violated by safe spaces if you still can go outside campus grounds and still say your same thing? Like how is it like in the safe spaces like
I would say
really being harmed?
The university or higher education is funded by tax dollars, which is linked directly to the federal government, which says that there should be no laws that limit free speech. So I would say that by these institutions implementing restrictions on free speech, on what is acceptable and not acceptable, is setting a precedent that says that these areas are okay for you to speak, these other areas are not okay for you to speak. And does that not just a slippery slope to saying, you can speak here, but you can't speak there. You can say this, but you can't say that. And we've, by and large, restrictions on free speech have been used against minorities vastly. And so in order to say that, free speech should be limited is to say, like, kind of, deny the history of what free speech has allowed. Free speech has allowed the safe space to debate all types of different topics. Back in the 1970s, for example, right here in California, Proposition 6 tried to ban gay and lesbian teachers from teaching in public schools. There was a safe space to allow the debate of that, which allowed Harvey Milk, he was the first elected gay politician in California, to went out all across the state to advocate for its defeat, and he was able to defeat that. So I would say that giving institutions of higher learning, which are tied to larger institutions, the ability to limit free speech is something that is not, it's an antithesis to democracy.
We have a president of the United States, and let me repeat that, a president of the United States, who says things that some people feel very offensive. Should we be excising statements made and discussions by the President of the United States and these types of things that are being said out of our universities and classrooms because they are upsetting.
Could you clarify your question?
You want to clarify the question? So the question is where's the line between verbal abuse and harassment and freedom of speech, and what of the harmful rhetoric by Trump directed at immigrants, Muslims, etc.? Should those not be discussed, or should people?
So I guess it's the question more along the lines of, should we be discussing controversial and potentially harmful topics?
The question
Even though they're
I guess
coming
the
from
question is,
people in
I'm
power?
going to stick with the beginning of this question, which is where, and because actually some other people have asked this too, where is the line? That's the question.
I guess I'll go first. So the line. So I guess like they're asking, where's the line of talking about these things that have been said? First, freedom of speech does not mean about discussing what President Trump said. I'm very comfortable to talk in a safe space about what President Trump said, so we can advocate for a better way of understanding his rhetoric. If President Trump, though, walks into a safe space and says those things, that is what I am advocating to not happen, for one. Because let's kind of like take a step back and understand safe spaces. Because till this point of this conversation, I feel like safe spaces are going from where I'm saying that there are designated zones within an academic institution, such as the MCC, the African American Center of Academic Excellence. That's what I'm saying. Freddie over here is explaining to us that it's the institution within himself. Okay. Safe spaces and academic institutions actually thrive from one another. Like I said before and a few questions ago, that when you have a safe space, it provides that platform to elevate voices that relatively won't be elevated in your traditional academic space. Historically, safe spaces have been warped and manipulated to benefit those who are privileged, because the privileged do not understand criticism and critique in the more proper way. So they try to make safe spaces seem as it's this exclusive.
I'm going to jump in. I'm sorry. I just want to
Wait, let
say
me finish,
that.
Freddie. I'm
Well,
almost done.
I'm not against like safe spaces. So I just want to say that. This is all in the spirit of debate.
Yeah.
Okay. I just feel like I'm kind of getting attacked, and it's like,
Oh, no, my
that's
bad,
not
my
what
bad.
I
No,
stand
yeah,
for.
yeah.
This is
Okay.
all for funsies.
Yeah.
So, so yeah, it's for the conversation.
Well, these questions seem to be, many of these questions seem to be directed at you, Fabian, I have to say.
Yeah. You could just hand them over. I'll just go one by one.
Okay, again, I'm going, as Freddie said, just as a reminder, this is in the spirit of the debate, and I really want to just take this opportunity to thank, again, both Freddie and Fabian. The first debate we had, we felt that it wasn't actually passionate enough, and I don't think we have that problem here. If the Multicultural Center, the Latinx Center, the African American Center were created for safe spaces and open to all students, why does it feel like these places divide us more instead? How can we make these spaces and the idea of safe spaces truly a safe space for all? You want to take that?
Can you repeat the question?
If the Multicultural Center, Latinx Center, African American Center were created to create a safe space for students and open to all students, why does it feel like these places divide us more instead? How can we make these spaces truly a safe space for all? Do you think that's relevant? If it's not relevant, I can move on.
I mean, I'm not quite sure. Yeah. Do you want to go ahead and take
Yeah,
it?
you can
No.
take it, Freddie. So whether or not it's relevant is more, I wouldn't say the relevance of it, just the text of it. More of how would you say it's divisive? You know, like what makes it divided? What is making it dividing a community? Because it's more, I see it more of a beneficial thing. Like even if you do have your like oppression Olympics within them or anything like that, they still provide those fundamental importance of a safe space, which is allowing people of those identities to remove themselves from an environment that is harmful to them, and allows them to be in those present spaces. I feel like that question maybe should have added, like, how is it being divided? Because I don't want to just sit up here and just assume what does it mean to be divided within those.
Yeah, I'm not
groups.
quite sure
Okay.
the basis
Well,
of
then
that question.
let me try to paraphrase what I'm reading in quite a few questions. I think these are complicated topics, and some people are having difficulty finding the right words for their questions. But one of the questions I had, which I think goes to the heart of some of these questions, is if you allow people to again, I'm going to go back to this word, take a path, and that's only because I actually have I struggle with words, which is a funny thing for a writer, but that's why I
It's much
fuss
easier
over
to
my
write.
writing. It's much easier writing than speaking. But if you allow people to take a pass on certain conversations, or you steer conversations within classrooms to only certain types of subject matters, then don't people who have a different way of thinking not actually have a safe space for their honest ideas? Do we end up in trying to encourage and empower the minority voices? And by minority voices, I am not necessarily saying ethnic minorities, I'm saying all minority voices, to empower them. Are we not actually creating an unsafe space for those people who might have ideas that conflict with what is socially acceptable? Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay.
I guess.
Okay.
I guess.
Well, the idea is that it's the idea of very controversial ideas. Okay, and some very controversial ideas make some people feel very uncomfortable. This is the idea of safe spaces. But in creating a safe space in which very controversial ideas might be stifled or suppressed, or people will vacate when they are aired, doesn't that actually create an unsafe space for those people who honestly have those ideas?
I zoned out for a second there. These are two I mean, let's get back to some basic stuff. Come on, let's get back to some basic stuff.
Okay, basic stuff. Let's move off the classroom and on to the
Yeah, I'm not going to
the
sit up
whole
here
campus.
and to, or who is and is not able to speak on a campus is extremely limiting in the discourse of conversation that takes place on those campuses. I understand that some of that, like some of the subject matter that may be discussed will be offensive to some, but I feel that, like I said before, universities are, one, they're institutions of higher learning. We should go to these places to challenge our thoughts, challenge our opinions, and to be able to hear things that we are opposed to and get out of that, not necessarily an offensive sort of reaction to it, but be able to understand where the people are coming from that we are opposed to. And by hearing what they are saying, we can understand not only what they're trying to say, but what we are opposed to within their movement or their actions. But also, these institutions are institutions of higher learning. They are, I guess, they're tied to taxes. And written right in our Constitution says that, Congress or the government in general cannot limit any sort of free speech that takes place on these campuses. And so to say that certain people are able to have these conversations and certain people are not is a violation of certain groups' freedom of speech.
I have two things to say about this. So, before I say those two things, yes, I do believe that there's certain people that should not be allowed to speak at university campuses for their harmful rhetoric. First, I'd just like to say, the concept of freedom of speech, because I feel like we could have defined that in the very start, provided definition of the terms other than just safe spaces, which I provided. So freedom of speech, I would say, it's freedom of speech isn't that simple. It's not just saying what you want and then not getting any punishment by it. It's kind of like where we saw Billy Bush got fired from his job because of the recording he said of his controversial comments with Donald Trump. And the Kellyanne Conways and the right-wing conservative TV spokesman and radios of the world were all saying like this was the violation of his freedom of speech. Like, no, that's not what freedom of speech is. It is hateful speech, and there's a grand difference between it because freedom of speech is to advocate for a position of influence and progressiveness of your own political ideologies. Hate speech is when you provide it to not only diminish the identity and reputation of an individual, but of a mass community and society. That's where Billy Bush got it wrong. He wasn't being violated in his freedom of speech. He got caught in hate speech. So when I say why there's certain people that can't be on the university campus and should not be invited, is because we have to kind of stray away of thinking that platforms are neutral, because they're not. Platforms aren't something that just stay solid and everyone's on the same playing field. Providing hate speech a platform is an elevation for those ideologies. Because when you have that platform, humans inherently are going to create this judgment within their minds when hearing these speeches and put importance on what values and what ideologies are vastly important. So even providing the most minimal platform in an academic setting for this hateful rhetoric is still providing an avenue and elevation for this hate speech that causes further harm than good, than providing any form of criticism. Because I know the arguments of like this is not educational because you're removing like this different form of ideology from the academic sphere. You're not. Because they still have their talk shows, they still have their conservative national conferences, they still have their radio shows, they can still say what they want. But at least in an academic setting, in an institution safe space, they do not have that platform because their safe spaces are not meant to elevate that hate speech. It's to make sure that hate speech does not spread into the identities of those people that those safe spaces are benefiting. And that's it.
Well, I guess that leaves it to, it's all subjective to the institutions. If you're in a position of power, you're able to, if you make the rules, you can change the rules. And safe spaces allow these institutions to be able to kind of steer the rhetoric of what is acceptable in a society. And these people oftentimes at these these positions of higher learning that run these campuses are unelected officials. These guys, by and large guys, are able to say what is and is not acceptable on their campuses. So to say that we should give up a certain amount of our rights to say what is and is not acceptable is just giving up a bit of freedom that should be held on to, especially in our current time, because universities should be the last place where ideas are deemed off limits or restricted.
I don't think it is. I think it's one of the first places to stop harmful rhetoric. It is the first place.
But I guess what defines what is harmful and not harmful rhetoric, and also when does this, who decides it? That's what I'm confused about.
Like who decides what harmful rhetoric is?
Yeah.
Or who decides
what?
whether somebody who someone invites onto a college campus, that the speech that they are giving is in fact hateful enough.
Okay. Hate is hate. It's not hateful enough. It's not, you did a little bit of hate, so you can probably, no. So, if ever the speech of that person, like, what's his name, Milo? I don't even know his name.
That was one of the questions.
Yeah, I don't want to even address who that person is. But if those individuals, if any form of their career, either academically, politically, socially, if they came on TV or they're like Instagram famous, because people are famous for that now. If any point of their careers they caused any oppressive harm, that is the basis of what deems it problematic. Because I get it, like it's hard to understand it, but systematically people, not saying that it's you, but like systematically people who come from a position of privilege can't truly understand what is oppressive because there's that resistance within them of, oh, well, all voices should be heard. Should they really though? All voices that are harmful shouldn't, because of what it causes to those individuals.
But should we not hear these people and hear what they have to say, and that therefore we should know who they are and
Exactly.
what
You
they
can
are
say that.
saying?
You can have that on your. I see that in the back. Like you can say it on their talk shows. They can still say it in their own platforms.
But those are private institutions. We live in an area, in a society where it says freedom of speech is protected by law, and also that government institutions cannot limit that. And then is not a university a governmental institution where freedom of speech should be protected?
Oh, I see where you're going at. No, because
And that actually goes to one of the
yeah, because
questions.
let's be honest. Do you really want to see on the steps of Washington D.C. hateful rhetoric? No.
No, I don't want to.
Exactly.
But do
Then
people
why in schools? Then why in schools? Like because
these aren't schools. These are institutions of higher learning. We should separate a university from a school. A school is for children. A university is for grown-ass adults. And that is to say that certain type of language is too unsafe for certain types of people to hear. That is one that's degrading and insulting to the people who go to these places. To say that this type of language is, it's too offensive for you to hear, so me as a governmental official, it will be able to control what you hear. Is that not just a slippery slope to some sort of like totalitarian regime saying that like this is what you need to know, this is not what you need to know? I mean, this is exactly how white supremacist institutions have been able to teach that.
again, let's not call it totalitarianism because that's not what this is. And secondly, again, they still have their own platforms to go out to. We live, like how you said, let me finish, Freddie. Like you said, we live in a society that is so vastly interconnected. Like if they wanted to hear that hate speech, like look it up on YouTube. Just not have it in the KBR, where people who are oppressed by this rhetoric on a daily basis can hear it from their dorm rooms or walk by it when they're going to class. They can still hear this hateful rhetoric if they wanted to on a different platform. I get it. The United States and the First Amendment, freedom of speech, like the schools are funded. I see what you're trying to say there. Like schools are government institutions, whatever. But it's still the government's responsibility to advocate for the best of overall society. Advocating for these harmful rhetoric is not the best for overall society. So it is academically responsible to provide this form of safe space for those students of that institution.
Because who is the government to decide what is best for the overall society? Like, I do not personally have that much trust in these institutions. Look who is currently in charge of our federal government. Do you really think that he has the best interest of everybody in mind when he is making these policies? And this is President Donald Trump, the guy who did Stone Cold Stunners on WWF.
Let me follow up with the question.
Go ahead.
The question that begs right now, and I have to say, I have a gazillion questions that we are not going to be able to get to because really we intended this to be a fairly quick 1 hour conversation, and we have flown through this. But who would make that determination of who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak?
That's exactly what I've been wondering. Is like, there was a professor I had last year, and she always her go-to saying was that those who make the rules can change the rules, and so those people in power who have this ability to rewrite how our society runs, if they are not, if we start to limit our speech to say that certain things are offensive and certain things are not offensive, are we not giving power to these institutions who, not always have our best interest in mind? And keep in mind, too, the current administration did not win by a popular vote. They won by an electoral college vote that is totally and also, in my opinion, an antithesis to a democracy. And so to say that we should be giving up our freedom of speech to these institutions because they know better than the common people, or they know better how to check challenging conversations, is a power that I'm not willing to give up.
Do you want to follow or you want?
So, when you, on the opposite side of that, Freddie, is when you do provide this platform for that hateful rhetoric, yeah, you're not giving power to the academic institution itself, but you're giving power to that hateful rhetoric in the long run. Like, this is the trade-in, like the trade-off you are giving if you're going to be making that argument, because no matter even if it's for 5 minutes or for 2 hours, giving a platform to hateful rhetoric is elevating it and giving it more power within an institution that is already oppressive towards their students of color and students from those marginalized communities. And also just kind of like linking like HSU academic institution to like the Donald Trump administration as if it's just a 1-2 step is kind of like misrepresenting of what this conversation is about. Like, I don't really think like allowing Humboldt State University to say hateful rhetoric should not be allowed in the KBR is providing any form of support or power to the Trump administration, because it's not that simple and it doesn't go directly to that link. And for this hate speech, I would more likely and happily give the academic institutions a little more leeway of telling us who can be on the college campuses than providing the platform of power to hateful rhetoric and people who spread that harmful rhetoric.
So I guess we should give, Lisa Rossbacher was in power for 5 years. Should we give her the power to say what is and what is not appropriate? And then also, some of these people who had these more explosive moments in their media were literally 15 minutes of fame. Milo Yiannopoulos is deplatformed. The guy is bankrupt. Richard Spencer gave a speech in Florida where 14 people showed up. So to say that I have to say that yes, we should amplify their voice, only so the counter resistance, the counter protest to this will be so large that they'll be ostracized out of society, just like what happened after Charlottesville, where they tried to unite the right round 2 in Boston, where 50 people showed up to a crowd of 30,000.
Yes, but here's that thing though. He went bankrupt because universities and institutions stopped asking him. Yes,
That's
he
not
did.
true.
Stop asking him to come.
He kept going.
Well, okay.
He got stopped at Berkeley, but he was all over the South.
Exactly.
We're
he
talking,
got stopped at Berkeley, an
but
institution.
he went on. He was debating in Arizona, in Texas, all over the South, in Florida.
But yeah, when he was stopped at Berkeley, that made national headlines, stopping him at an institution that values safe space over the concept of supporting hateful rhetoric. That's what led to his downfall, because when we allow to see that in the public sphere, it changed the way that we perceive the way that education systems should uphold those platforms for those speakers.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Knowledge is power. To be informed is power. Should students be able to pick and choose what they learn or what they hear? Yeah, well, I'm just going to throw them at you, hopefully.
So is this just like, okay, so, I don't know, I guess, like how I said in the beginning, historically, and the research shows it, safe spaces are going to continuously, and even throughout this conversation, going to be warped and misunderstood of what a safe space truly is, because from the start of this conversation, I said safe spaces are reserved spaces in the academic institution for those people, not the academic institution within itself.
Yeah. I agreed with that. And I guess I'm going to reiterate this. I was horrified to come up here tonight. And I agree with safe spaces are a very essential part of the learning process at HSU, and it's something that as a white man, I don't like. My safe space is just society in general. And so I try as hard as I can to empathize with the need for a safe space, and I value those places and respect them as much as I humanly possibly can. And so I just really wanted to say that again.
Okay.
I'm not up here like, yeah, Milo's the shit. That dude's a piece of shit.
Okay, we're gonna end on a question which I think is a good ender of this, and that's: are the two of you in agreement if the space is outside of a designated group space? Is that what you're saying? You're saying that the speech is free for all as long as it's not on the college campus.
Oh my God, someone was listening to me. Yes, I said this is not about removing the freedom of speech of these individuals. They still have their platforms, their radio stations, the YMCAs of your local hometown. Like, they still have all those places to spread their hateful rhetoric. It is about the designated spaces within an academic institution, not the academic institution of itself, if those people should be in there. I say, if they're in the MCC house, kick them out. If they're in the African American Center, the Latin American Center, get the F out. If you want to be in the D Street Community Center and you fund it yourself, go ahead and say what you want to say. They are still able to say that and still be able to spread their platform. Freedom of speech is not hate speech. Billy Bush had the right to be fired for what he said on tape, because that is not freedom of speech, and that is not a violation of his freedom of speech. Hate speech is hate speech. Freedom of speech is something that I still think in this conversation could have been defined a little bit better.
I guess we differ on what it means for our government to offer protections of freedom of speech. It sounds like you want to put the onus on private institutions and not on the government to go ahead and guarantee that access to freedom of speech. You continue to say that it is on the onus of these private corporations to give the platform to these people. But if we go back in society and go back in history and look at who benefited from freedom of speech and then also who is, does not benefit from it, marginalized groups have routinely benefited from the freedom of speech, not at private institutions. They benefited from the freedom of speech from protests. They benefited from the freedom of speech through mass demonstrations to make democracy bend to their will.
Okay.
Do you want to continue?
I just want to critique that comment. No, people of color did not benefit from freedom of speech. Freedom of speech has been there, but yet we still saw people in the civil rights era. We still saw people during the first, second, and third wave of feminism being silenced and put down by government policies of explaining why they can't have freedom of speech.
But the freedom of speech gives them the opportunity to push back against that narrative. It offers them a subversive right. And without the freedom of speech, the people in power are able to say what is and what is not acceptable.
Exactly. But this is kind of like an example of a violation of freedom of speech, right? Like, not saying that you're meaning to interrupt, but kind of like saying, like, let me finish.
That's bullshit,
let
dude.
Me finish,
that's fucking
let
bullshit.
me finish my comment about, I'm just kidding, Freddie. But like in the end of it, like how Freddie and I said in the beginning, this is just like, a very fun activity of like explaining like how it looks like to be like very on the opposite sides of things.
Right.
Like Freddie and I might not necessarily agree on what we were placed on, but we did like try to understand the ideas and ideologies of people who do come from different perspectives and different ideologies. And kind of like in the very end of saying it, this isn't an easy topic. This isn't an easy conversation to have. It's very difficult and complicated, especially how research shows historically safe spaces are always going to be misconstrued to benefit those of privileged positions, to always demonize it and minimize it as something that's not necessary. And also freedom of speech is always going to consistently be manipulated to justify everyone's version of speech, because no person can like confidently say this is what freedom of speech is, because someone else is always going to come up and say that's not what that is. Yeah.
You want to say something finally? So this was a demonstration of two people taking polar extremes and being able to maintain a fairly long conversation. One thing there's a few things that are really interesting about this conversation. One is it could have gone much, much deeper. We could, in order for it to go much, much deeper though, which is why I think I skipped some questions, and I apologize to everyone. Thank you so much for all these great questions. Is that these conversations can literally go all night long, and some of you might have had all night long conversations. The other thing is conversations like this never have resolutions. They never, ever have resolutions. And I think one of the things that the reasons why we avoid difficult conversations now in society with our friends and with our families and with people we don't even know is that for some reason we expect resolutions with our conversations, and we don't get them. You will never get them with a difficult conversation. And so what I'm hoping is that everyone who came here, these ideas are just buzzing through your brain. And you are going to want to have to get them out there. And so you will actually try to engage someone you know with some of these ideas. And what we are giving you is a way to do that, because now you can say, oh yeah, there was this guy on the stage, and he said this crazy thing. And I thought, and then this other guy said this other crazy thing. And that will engage you in the conversation with your own crazy friends who have crazy ideas on this. But this was great. I have to say that you guys did such a absolutely fantastic job, and I hope all of you appreciate it. Again, let me just repeat. I asked Freddie to take a side, and I asked Fabian to take a side, and they did a fabulous job doing it. The thing is that most people are not polarly opposed in conversations. Sometimes they are, most of the times they're not. Sometimes we get into these conversations and we find ourselves taking extreme positions. And that's what happens in arguments. And so eventually what will happen in a good conversation is you both reach either an impasse or you reach some kind of agreement. And I was not allowing them to do that here. Just so you know, I was really not allowing them to come to an agreement. And they actually are more in agreement than they are opposed, and they did a fantastic job. And thank you guys so much.